and Murder on the Orient Express to us.
Thank you very much.
Well, certainly Murder on the Orient Express is a very classic mystery novel, and certainly one of Agatha Christie's most beloved ones. But I wanted to know what drew you to this particular novel, and how did you make it your own, not only as director, but also as Hercule Poirot?
Well, I came across the book. My mother started reading crime fiction when I was in my early adolescence, so I would see these books, including this one, around the house. And first of all, the title. I think it's a great title. There are 3 words that get me going: Murder, Orient, and Express. This seems very clever to combine those 3. And I remember reading it and admiring how many characters she used, and I felt that was a smart way of keeping the audience guessing, and she choreographed that very well. I loved the evocation of the golden age of travel. I wanted to get onto that train. I liked the winter setting, so December, and then when it came to me from Fox, Michael Green, who's had an extraordinary year as a screenwriter, as you know, he's written the screenplay for Blade Runner 2049, and he's created American Gods, the TV show from the Neil Gaiman novel, brilliant, I think. So he's in amazing creative form, and he changes the beginning. It's not the same as the novel. It's not the same as the '74 movie. And we, particularly regarding the second part of your question, Hercule Poirot, we have the chance of a sort of an arc for the character that takes us from a man who, at the beginning of the story, says there is right, there is wrong, there is nothing in between, all the way through to a moment where, when we know who and how and why, we then have to consider, well, is there something in between? He's a moral absolutist, and his obsessions, if you like, what he calls his little originalities, they're less the behaviours of a sort of a dandy, and more of a sort of obsessive compulsive individual, so that when those eggs are not the same size, or when that hotel room is an odd number, not an even number, these things almost pain him. Disharmony and imbalance are things that can, produce a collapse. So when he comes up against something that he ought to have a solution to, and he asks the question, where does conscience lie? It makes for a kind of chewy moral issue. So I think Michael dealt with all the things I liked: the glamour, the travel, the darkness, and then in Poirot he gave a different kind of character journey for a different kind of obsessive.
Question ici. Micro. N'hésitez pas à lever, si vous voulez.
Hi. Thanks for the movie. It's really brilliant. It's a 2-part question. The first part is, how did you come up with such a big casting, like all these A-list stars? And second of all, what would you give as an advice to have such a beautiful moustache?
Thank you. Thank you. The first part of the question, the key to the casting was Judi Dench. Judi Dench was the first person I asked, and she was the first person to say yes before I finished the sentence where I asked her. I asked her by, as you know, the handkerchief that Princess Dragomirov eventually owns up to having has the N, or the H, which becomes the Russian N. And when I asked Judy to be in it, we got an original lace handkerchief and embroidered her initials in the handkerchief. And she was very taken with that. So we bribed her, basically. And she said yes, at least she knew she was going to get a free handkerchief out of it, But once she was on board, she became a kind of magnet. And someone like Johnny Depp worships Judy, absolutely worships her. When they all came together for the first time, literally physically together, they were going to do their first scene, and they were outside the steps of the dining car. And I was on the dining car, and I saw them. They were all very shy with each other, very sort of awestruck. bizarrely enough. And Michelle Pfeiffer was the first person to come up the steps onto the carriage. So I said hello, and I noticed there were tears in her eyes. I thought, Christ, what's happened? I said, are you all right? She said, I just met Judi Dench. I feel so emotional. You know, people also knew, I think, that they would have a chance to explore interesting and different characters, and I think they knew that I love performance. I like actors, so I want them to be good. I want to help as best I can, and that they would enjoy being in that group, which they did. They really enjoyed that. As to the moustache, took a few months of realizing the brutal truth. I could not grow that moustache. I have neither the follicle power nor the chemical hormonal combination to produce the sort of double handlebar swirl that my friend Carol Hemming designed. So we spent the following few months sticking things on me and using a bust of me, and we must have had 11 versions of that thing. Agatha Christie referred to them in the novels, as she said in the plural, he wore the most magnificent moustaches in England. She used the plural. Often it was described as magnificent and immense. So the idea was to produce this kind of mask, his superpower, if you like, which he hides behind and he observes people through. And almost his greatest delight is for people to dismiss him. Mary Debenham, Daisy Ridley's character, says in the novel, he was a perfectly ridiculous little man, the sort of man with that moustache that you could not take seriously. And when people do not take Poirot seriously, he has a chance to watch and observe and be a better detective. So the first morning, Daisy actually walked on the set and saw me in the moustache for the first time. She said, Jesus, that's bold. I said, good bold? She said, yeah, good bold, good bold. So I think we tried to meet Agatha Christie's demand in the book.
And moustaches, plural.
Yes. So we got the two, yeah.
Question, ici.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the film, and
Thank you.
you for coming and presenting it to us.
Thank you.
I feel like we also talk about French accent. Weren't you a bit scared to show the movie to a French audience? And how did you work on it? And
well, in theory, always scared. But in theory, of course, it's his version. He's a Wallonian Belgian who has spoken French but lives in the novels mostly in England. And an interesting thing that he says in the books, aside from the moustache, which he knows has people dismiss him or find him ludicrous, he also says in the novels that he can speak perfectly good idiomatic English, but chooses not to because the world of the broken accent is one that also offers a mask. People also in the glib and patronizing way of some folk find that something that they can choose to suggest means that he's somehow not as sharp or as smart as possible. And with I don't speak French, so or even though most of my life I've tried, but I seem to have a sort of block with languages thus far. But it's fun to keep trying. So I did all the way through for probably 6 months until I thought I could maybe possibly order a hotel room that had a shower. That's about as far as I got successfully in French. The goal was really to find an English-speaking Belgian accent that seemed to match the sort of timbre of my voice, and where we could meet that sort of the playfulness with which Poirot speaks. But the process of sort of creating him was quite immersive. I got a chance to read the books, and there are 33 of them. There are 50 short stories, and I was prepping the film while I was in a theatre season, and I knew I was doing about 9 months ahead of time, and I was able to be very ritualistic each day about working on the accent, or working on the moustache, or working on the walk, getting the handmade shoes, getting the fabric for the clothes, beginning to understand his obsessions. And it was very it was a very, very, very rewarding experience to have that much preparation, which was also completely necessary because I knew that once everybody arrived, I had to be so ready for it that my work on accent and moustache, everything else to do with the sort of technical makeup of Poirot had to be ready to go. Yeah.
Question. Ici.
Oui. Bonsoir. Hello. Speaking about books, when you read a book, do you see the scenes playing out of your head like a movie? And I've got the second question about the train. In the, it's a confined space. Is it like a theater play for you?
Well, yes. The truth is that I do. I'm mainly drawn to scripts where, when I read them, I can sort of intuitively feel a sense of the sort of visual. So, for instance, a shot that was in my mind, or an approach that was in my mind, when we go to Istanbul station, there's a shot which has Marwan Kazari, who plays Jean-Michel, or Pierre-Michel. So he comes left to right, and then we see the train, we see Johnny Depp and Josh Gad in the train, we turn around and there's Penelope Cruz coming in, then we go across and get me and Tom Bateman, we go up, we find Daisy Ridley, and then we get him onto the train, and there's Michelle Pfeiffer, and as we walk down the train, we're still in the same shop as Derek Jacobi, and then we meet, anyway, so a lot, all the way through to Poirot getting into his cabin, and I instinctively knew I wanted to do that, and I knew that I wanted to have him leave the train by starting on a Steadicam shot also that took him out and went all the way back through the train that we met when it was champagne and fun and people and music and lightness and romance, and now we walk down the same train after death and snow and frozenness and the understanding of the loss, and you start to listen to that, and then when it comes to the confined nature of the train, I did want to exploit that where it would work for the kind of paranoia and claustrophobia, but I specifically wanted to trap us not in a snowdrift that is in the novel, but in an avalanche, in a more sort of jeopardized and dangerous location, so that we could get out, and McQueen could try to run, and Poirot could try to bring people out of the confined space if he thought that interviewing Mary Debenham outside would get more out of her than interviewing Penelope Cruz in the kitchen. And I wanted at times, and I really enjoyed, there's a great moment in Alfred Hitchcock's film Dial M for Murder, where when Ray Milland is setting up with an accomplice how to kill Grace Kelly, it's Hitchcock suddenly jumps to a top shot where we don't see, when he's in it for 5 or 6 minutes. And I remember seeing that and thinking, in the train, that's how I'd like to discover the body, except I don't want to see the body. So I want to have the audience I want the audience to want to nudge the camera up so that they see, is it Johnny Depp? Is he really dead? Is he killed in a particular way? But in going there, I wanted to put, in that confined space, our audience here in the same position as the people on the train who know something's happened. They're acting, but exactly what Poirot has seen. So the confines of the train made me feel very sort of inventive about how to be in it, out of it, on top of it, underneath it, and in a way make it sort of, in a way, untheatrical, but cinematic. Thank you.
Ici, je crois. Bonsoir. Désolée, je vais la faire en français. Donc, c'est une histoire qui a déjà été racontée au cinéma, donc c'est adapté d'un livre. Comment est-ce que, en tant que metteur en scène, vous avez travaillé pour, malgré le fait que ce soit une histoire que beaucoup de gens connaissent déjà, pour qu'il y ait quand même du suspense, pour qu'on ait quand même une tension, notamment à la fin, en fait, la dernière partie de la révélation. Il y a des gens qui ont déjà vu le précédent film, qui ont lu le livre, qui vont voir votre film, donc il va y avoir forcément une comparaison. Et du coup, comment est-ce qu'on travaille pour s'assurer qu'on captive jusqu'au bout un maximum de gens, y compris des gens qui connaissent déjà l'histoire?
Well, obviously this is a well-known and beloved novel. It was transposed to the screen already. So, as a director, how do you manage to always try to keep the suspense going, the tension going, and of course also to avoid comparisons? Basically, how do you keep us guessing, even when we know what might happen?
Well, it's a good question. It's one we had to answer early on, and I'm familiar with it because having come from the classical theatre. I mean, for instance, last year I directed a production of Romeo and Juliet, and most people know what happens at the end. Romeo and Juliet don't make it. Sorry, that's a spoiler alert, I should say. Forgive me if I've ruined your experience of Shakespeare, but in this case, we did make some changes. So the book begins in Syria, in Aleppo. The 74 movie begins with a flashback of the Armstrong murder. And we begin in Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall with the idea of presenting Poirot in action with a denouement to another case. And I remember reading and thinking that when the policeman runs and gets himself caught on that cane, that was a very pleasing example of Poirot being a little ahead of us, and that already that might make the audience start to feel, oh, so that's not what we're used to. Plus, he himself is a little more active, and we're in a different place. And so to do that early, I think, was important. We changed some characters around. So in the 74 film, there's a character, and in the book, there's a character called Greta Olsen, who was played by Ingrid Bergman. Here, there's a character called Pilar Estravados, who is Penelope Cruz. And an Italian in the book, Antonio Foscarelli, becomes Beniamina Marquez with Manuel Garcia Ruffalo. And crucially, this sort of end, what you might call this end moral coda, was at work. I suppose we were constantly, for instance, Sidney Lumet, who directed the great 74 film, and who I got a chance to meet and spend some time with later in his career, said to me about this subject that he wanted to make a romp, R-O-M-P, a sort of, something that, and the music of that film is very, everything's sort of, it's got a little kind of flourish, a sort of flourish. Whereas for me, this movie was more of a brood. So I wanted to set up a first movement that was about the joy of travel. I want, big landscape in Jerusalem, and then the thrill, which I feel when you're getting on a train that's going on an exotic trip. But then I wanted to take layers away and make it dirtier and darker and more brooding, so that everything was about trying to keep a lid on the kind of passion that Michelle Pfeiffer's character reveals when we see what happens at the end. And also in my mind constantly was the mob, the 12 of them. For me it's very disturbing to see somebody sort of as elegant as Judi Dench, getting in there. So it's all just sort of ugly, but from civilized people who are carrying this incredible hurt. When I was working on this, I was also directing a production of Hamlet in the theatre with Tom Hiddleston. And I found strong parallels in these two revenge dramas about what happens when people, and we use the line in the film, are reacting to the poison of deep grief. And I suppose that's what I felt was what underneath it all would keep our audience a little more thrown off balance. Start differently, change the characters, but keep the underneath, also allowing us, as we discussed, to move different locations and stuff, and feel also, finally, I suppose, in the performance of it. One of the things that I said to the actors, I would meet with each actor and talk about the character, but when we got on set, I wouldn't rehearse. We'd sit like this and we'd shoot immediately, because I always wanted to get everybody's first, sometimes even nervous, impressions. I didn't want anything settled. I wanted to feel that the dialogue had an improvised quality. And sometimes when it's a first take and you haven't rehearsed and you're shooting on film, inside you're a little like that, holding on to but it does something to your eyes, it does something to your body language that makes me feel more like that person knows that the answer to this question is literally a matter of life and death. was stuck on a mountain in Yugoslavia in 1934. If I get blamed for this, I'm dead, I'm hung, rather than death as a parlour game and that kind of, oh, Inspector, and that kind of, sort of thing. So all of those things were about going, even if you know who, we will explain differently how, we'll explain differently why, and then critically, we will explain differently, what do we do now? What is justice? Is justice closure? Is justice revenge? Poirot finds it very difficult to conceive that the way to control human affairs is to say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. With the loss of an innocent, the loss of a child, anything's possible. He finds that really difficult, and yet he understands the gargantuan pain involved. So all of that is more in the air in this version, and for me that constitutes something that speaks differently to a brilliant and beautiful romp.
Well, I mean, you just mentioned in terms of closure, deep grief, revenge, and Michelle Pfeiffer and the music, which is not a romp in that movie. Mm-hmm. You even composed a song for her, which is precisely about that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the song Never Forget?
Well, Pat Doyle and I have written lots of songs. Pat Doyle has composed the music for nearly all of my films. And sometimes we write a song in order to understand what we think it's about. We never even play it to anybody. Sometimes we don't, but a lot of times we do, because it's a way of articulating what we think it is. And here, the sort of the ache, the terrible ache that would mean, in a way, there are no winners in this story. So when he leaves them, he says, I hope you may find your peace with this. I hope we all, whether they have a chance to heal, maybe, whether they can or not, I don't know. And the song was a sort of response to this, trying to somehow say that maybe there is some beautiful resignation or acceptance that just says, we've done everything we can, including this incredible, violent act of revenge, and the loss is still there, and you are still gone, and we still miss you, and it still hurts, but we won't forget. And that's one of the things I found when I was working on Hamlet recently was and having worked on that play a lot over the years, that there seems in the play just a simple sort of acknowledgement that human beings must, for their own sort of health, mark the passing of loved ones. We know very little when we come into this world, except that we will die, and that everyone else will, and possibly our first experience of death will be losing people we love. So if that happens naturally, it's one thing. If it happens because they have been violently removed, it's another thing. So the problem in Hamlet is that Hamlet's father dies and his mother marries almost immediately. And here you really feel in all of the characters that the acknowledgement of the death, the marking of the death, the ritual of closure is necessary. And somehow, by the time we got to the end of the movie, we thought, well, a song does it, because the musical theme is from the inside of the film. It's how it accompanies the death, as it were, of Johnny Depp's character. And when we talked to Michelle about doing it, her first reaction was she wanted to make sure her voice was in good shape. And I said, well, it's not really so much about the musical perfection. It's about experiencing it. It's about it's being it rather than doing it. So it's not about showing off. She sings very beautifully, but it's more about living through that emotion. You still get to the end of the song, and it's sort of agonizing, because it's just when my parents passed, I just remember. The very, very hard to just get past initially. This won't ever change. This won't ever change. I found that it's very hard, isn't it? It's very hard. It's difficult. So anyway, the song was a response to trying to put that into the film, because that's what we felt was underneath the story.
Question ici. Où est le micro? On ne voit pas bien. Oui.
I want to say I'm a big fan of yours.
Thank you.
Your work. I really like your work on the Shakespeare film and Frankenstein. I do wonder if the film is a success, if there is other movies with Hercule Poirot. Je vais peut-être le dire en français en fait parce que sinon je vais
If the film is a success, basically, will we see you and your moustaches again, right?
J'ai juste d'autres questions aussi. Si le tournage de Dunkerque a eu un impact sur la préparation du film, et si M. Branack a une théorie concernant le fait que les personnages américains, que dans les films américains, les personnages français utilisent beaucoup de mots en français quand ils parlent en anglais.
All right. So the first part of the question, the moustaches, will they be back again? And acting in Dunkirk with Christopher Nolan directing, did it sort of feed into the way you directed Murder on the Orient Express?
Well, for the first part of the question, I don't know if France has the television program Big Brother, but in England we have this reality show, and at the end, when they decide, when they talk about who's going to be thrown out of the house, a big solemn voice always says, "You decide." So when it comes to are there going to be more Poirots, you decide, because it'll be a simple business of whether enough people go to the movie to see it. I'd love to do some more. Yeah, I loved playing him, and for some of the reasons we've just been talking about. For potentially a kind of broad appeal movie, if that's what it is, and I'd love lots of people to see it. I feel it touches on so many things that are so interesting inside something that can be very, very entertaining. So I hope so. And then, as far as Dunkirk goes, it was really a pleasure and a privilege to be directed by Christopher Nolan. He was very, very helpful to me as an actor, and very supportive, and it was a very real kind of relationship. Watching him be calm in the middle of the crazy logistics of thousands of your countrymen dressed as English soldiers live on the beach of Dunkirk with real boats and real planes and 65mm film cameras, which are very heavy, all being used in handheld mode. So Hoyte van Hoyte, who was the DP, was like a kind of bodybuilder using this stuff. I really admired seeing him retain a personal focus that I tried to follow myself. When directing things on this scale, it's good to be able to be calm at the center of the storm, so you can stay creative and not get sucked into the chaos, because it's all chaos. Christopher Nolan was a great example of that. A very personal film was being made in a spectacularly, sort of inevitably chaotic scenario, and that's how most films are actually. And his what you might call grace under pressure was what affected how I directed this movie.
Question.
Hi. First of all, I also have to say it. You just have no idea how much it means to me that to have this opportunity to finally meet you. And as for my question, you just spoke about your work with Patrick Doyle about the song, but your musical collaboration is one, I think, of the greatest of the last 20 years on cinema. What could you tell us about this specific score and the way you both work together? Because once again, it's very different. The music is omnipresent. There's a lot of music, a lot of piano, some harp as well. How did you work together on the score, not the song?
Well, as soon as I know that I'm doing a picture, I talk to Patrick, and we usually sort of meet for lunch or whatever, and just talk instincts, intuition, and sometimes that intuition leads us to a sort of very settled place, and sometimes it changes. For instance, on this film, there was an initial discussion where we felt that there wouldn't be much music, actually, it's interesting. The very first thing we did was to write a song, but it was another song. It hasn't made it into the movie, although the theme has. And that was when we thought that the movie would maybe be a little more glossy. I mean, it's still, we shoot on 65mm and we're widescreen, and for me it's inspired by John Ford and David Lean and John Sturges and the kind of movies that wrap around you in big spaces, big graphic spaces. I guess we thought it was going to be a bit more sort of jazzy in some way. So for a long time, about 2/3 of the way through the post-production process, we were still not really very much music. And then it was a tipping point. Probably the first cut of the movie was 2.25 hours, and then I knew I didn't want it to be any longer than it needed to be. I wanted it to be very fast-paced relative. It's 1 hour 46, I think it is. Once it went under 2 hours, it suddenly felt like we needed tonally to mark a little more severely the excitement of the beginning with the way in which the layers of the story and the lies of the characters began to be revealed, and it became a more emotional story and requiring a different kind of quality in the music. We still, in relative terms, stayed more spare than we sometimes are. So when we came to record it, much fewer strings used than some of our sort of lush scores. But there was quite a lot of music that got kind of thrown out on the way to it, you know, and then we came back to something where the thematic material stayed pretty small. There aren't vast numbers of tunes, but trying to find a way to be mysterious without being arch and without being sort of too self-conscious or trying to manipulate the audience. The audience are way too smart for that. Was an interesting thing. So it's sometimes we get stuck, and we often have. For instance, the music that plays over the killing at the end. We must have done a dozen versions of that. I did a version that was without sound at all. We did a version that really ramped up, blood spurting out, flesh being, you know, whatever. And it just, somehow that didn't work. Then we did, do you know that piece by the Finnish composer Arvo Part Spiegel? Spiegel, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it's a very, very unusual piano and violin piece, and that was a kind of pointer to a certain way to go. And we go off and we listen to other stuff as well, and we say, well, it's not that, or it's a bit like that, or whatever. But finding, because that moment's interesting, it has a terrible beauty to it, and depending on your point of view, you are happy that he's getting stabbed because you want that kid to be revenged, because how appalling that this innocent is just taken away in this appalling act of violence, and yet it's like a bunch of dogs, you know, going at something. So they've parked their humanity, you might say, at the door, and they said, we will be monsters ourselves now for this moment. And yet, it had this kind of terrible beauty. So trying to find that simplicity it's like to answer how we work, I suppose it's an ongoing conversation. And what's great about him is that he revises and re-revises, and he really starts early, and he visits the set, and he talks to everybody else. He talks to Alexander Byrne, who did the costumes. We all know each other, they all go way back, you know. So everybody talks early and very broadly about the theme, and then he's just super. He's a very emotional guy, Patrick, so it's sometimes quite difficult. I love him very, very much. He's one of my dearest friends. It's very difficult when you have to say, I don't think that works, because everything will have been produced through blood, sweat and tears. So he's very Scottish, and he's got a very thick accent, and the sound that I don't like hearing, but I've occasionally produced when he's done something. And like most writers, most creators, when they present you something, they always say, I think this is great. I love this. I absolutely love this. You're dead, aren't you? Dead in the water because they've already said that. And you say, I find whatever way it is to say, I don't think that quite works. and his head drops. And in his Scottish accent, he goes, I don't fucking believe this. I don't fucking believe it. I don't fucking believe that. And then he goes off and he has a kind of, he goes off and has a bit of a moment. And then, if I'm lucky, I get a call the next day where he goes, I think you might be right. I think you might be right. Or I sometimes will come around and say, you know the piece of music you played, the first one you wrote out of instinct that I said I didn't think was good? I now realize that's it. I'm very sorry. Can we have it back, please?
Dernière question. Quel micro, oui.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for this movie, first and foremost. I wanted to come back to the directing of the movie. It's very classic, like a tribute in a way to Hitchcock and all the movies that are at the golden age of cinema in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You used also the use of black and white for the flashbacks and the murder and everything. Why did you do that, first and foremost? And how was it hard for you to come back to a classicism after doing all the movies that you've done, like Thor, like Cinderella and everything?
Well, first of all, the black and white, I love black and white. I made a couple of movies which feature it. I made a little comedy in the Bleak Midwinter, which I'm very, very fond of. In terms of work of mine, which is I just loved shooting on actual black and white film. And then I had the experience of working on a movie called Dead Again, which was the second film I directed, and it was in relative terms there was a complication. It's a reincarnation thriller. And one of the things that I found when we previewed it was originally shot all in color, was that the audience were confused, and like 5 previews in, when we were kind of dying, we went back to Scott Frank, the screenwriter's original thought, which was that the sequences in the past should be in black and white, and it transformed the audience's ability to understand this more or less complicated story. So I just knew that I had experienced that sometime. I wanted to have a series of clear rules, if you like. You've got 15 characters at different locations. The reporting of a plot, again, is relatively complicated. And I thought, if we, at one stage, I tried a technique where every time a character lied, and we had a flashback, I would go back and I would use their point of view. So it would be, if it was Derek Jacobi lying about Johnny Depp, I'd do a shot as if from his point of view over the cups. So you wouldn't see him, you see 2 hands, and you see a few films have used this. There was a Dick Powell film that used that entire technique for the whole film back in the 30s. Even that got too complicated because people said, where are we exactly? So it became simpler to say, when we are explaining what's going on, and it is true, will be in black and white, and it just, amid everything else that you need to be understanding and feeling, that ought to send a sort of a clear message. And to sort of address your other question, I've had an interesting, these last, where are we now? So I went to start shooting or prepping Thor at the beginning of 2009. So that's 8 years ago, and this is my 4th sort of Hollywood studio movie after a lot of independence and all the rest of it. And what I would say about arriving at this one is that I could feel the cumulative effect of the experience I had, where my interest remained pretty much constant. I love performance. I like to see good acting. I like to see it in subtlety and in depth. But I enjoy a cinematic experience. I like to be transported. I like to go to places and in worlds that can be slightly heightened and presented in a heightened way. And in some ways, I feel like they all have a connection. And I remember one time, referring to the question about Patrick, I remember when we were in the recording sessions for the score for Thor, and I was hearing this piece of music which was played with Anthony Hopkins and Chris Hemsworth at the end, and it seemed very much somehow about fathers and sons and I don't know, your place in the world. I remember going into the studio and saying to Pat, I think, I'm wondering, Pat, if I always, whatever it is, I always make the same film. Do you think you always write the same score? I mean, I know they appear to be superficially different, but, you know, and maybe this is, you know, what everybody does, but I really, at times this summer when I was working on both, I could see such a connection between Hamlet and Murder on the Orient Express that, you know, it doesn't, in a way, you know, much of it is to do with, you know, making sense of our place in the world, whether in a trivial way, it's a man putting on a production of Hamlet, in our case in black and white, where he has quite an explicit speech and scene about what makes life worth living. And in a way, something like Orient Express comes back to a version of that, which is, if you lose your daughter or your child in this way, what can make life worth living? What gives that already seems to take meaning away from life? Arbitrary violence in a world that seems godless. So what makes life worth living? Is it remembering her? Is it avenging her? And so arriving at this from those other movies in a way didn't seem so different. I carry my same preoccupations, I carry my same questions, and they frame themselves in different ways according to the story. And then, I mean, I'm answering it now because you've asked an interesting question, thank you very much, but mostly I don't think about that. Mostly I follow my instinct, and then I find myself considering it because you asked me and thinking, well, maybe there's something, maybe they all join up in some way. Maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's good, maybe it's not.
Well, thank you very much for talking about mystery, grief, loss, but also thank you